Hello, everyone. This is Dean Eaton from Exponential Australia, Ministry Leadership Network Catalyst. And today I'm really glad to have with us Chris Podlich, who is working for the Lutheran Church of Australia in New Zealand and also is a church planter up in Brisbane. We're going to hear a bit more about both of those things in a minute. Chris, welcome to Exponential Australia today.
Mate, thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of what you're doing.
Thank you. We are looking forward to hearing about you and your story. One of the things that I wanted to ask you first, Chris, was tell everyone a bit about who you are. There's even a bit of sports in your background that I'd be interested to hear about.
Yeah. So I am born and bred in the northern suburbs of Brisbane. Kind of grew up in a Christian family, but I grew up in a great local church, but in a very traditional local church. And so you grow up going to church, hearing about the gospel, but then in my mind, I was always like, but my mates are not going to connect with what we're doing. So I think I always had a passion for trying to connect people to Jesus and kind of trying to figure out how we do that in a church context. And so also have a passion, like obviously kind of you said, through sports, football, which soccer, I say football. Our South Australian listeners might disagree, but I say it's the game you play with a foot and a ball, as it says in the name.
The beautiful game. Yeah.
Exactly. The world game, the beautiful game. And so I played a lot of that growing up and had the opportunity through that to kind of travel around the world and ended up at a university in the States playing at the college level and happened to be a Lutheran university, a Christian university. And I think through that process, God kind of called me and dragged me kicking and screaming to end up planting churches. So I'm also married. I've been married to my wife Emma for we've been married just gone 7 years.
7 good years.
Yeah, that's 7 great years. And she's a teacher locally here as well. So she grew up in central Queensland and then moved to Brisbane when she was around grade 10. So, And again, she grows up from a family who her dad was a pastor in the Baptist church. But again, she had a lot of friends who weren't Christians. And the thing she was always thinking is like, they had a rule. If you sleep over on Saturday night, you have to come to church Sunday morning. And she kind of grew up with this, like, what are my friends going to think if they come to church? Is it going to be weird? How do we make it accessible to people who don't know Jesus? So, yeah.
Wow. Fantastic. Chris, I had the privilege of working with you for some years on a national team that was starting really from scratch in developing a church planting movement, multiplication movement within the Lutheran Church of Australia, and we shouldn't forget New Zealand. And it's called the Lutheran Church of Australia New and Renewing Team. And you've got a part-time role in that team, working under now Nathan Hett, who's the director of that team and works very hard, and Tanya Nelson and that whole crew at Lutheran HQ, as we refer to it. Tell us a little bit about what you do on the team.
I guess my role has evolved and changed. I'm trying to think how many years I've been there, probably 4 or 5, but you were the one who kind of got me on originally. And over time, my role has morphed and changed as the Lutheran Church has become more missional and planted more churches. And so now what I primarily do is I focus on the church planters network that we have within the Lutheran Church. So my role specifically is to care for, guide, mentor, and provide what I say the 3 C's: coaching, care, and connection for our church planters network. And so that's kind of my role there.
That's wonderful. And you've got church planters all across Australia at the moment, haven't you? You've got from Perth through to the East Coast. And
yeah, in fact, just at the time that we're recording this, the last Sunday, like we just launched our latest public worship service in Perth. A guy called Matty Schubert and his wife Becca have been planting. They planted Everhope Church around the Baldivis region, and then we got some crew in ACT and Western Sydney and all floating around, which is awesome to see. It's really cool to see what God's doing.
Yeah, that's great. Let's talk a little bit about what you like about church planting. I mean, you connect across the board beyond beyond the Lutheran network. You do connect with other networks and learn from other movements. And tell us a bit about your connections there and some of the things you've appreciated.
Oh, I think one of the things that I love is that, like, as Australia as a country kind of goes to this like really post-Christian, it's weird. I feel like we're kind of in this post-Christian but also pre-Christian generation.
Yeah.
And I think one of the great things about that is the body of Christ is starting to kind of knock down some of these walls that existed in the past, and we're starting to make the main thing again. Yeah. And so I just love learning. Like, that's one of the things I love. And so I love kind of connecting with the Pentecostals and the Uniting Church and the Baptist Church and the Anglican Church. And I just love hearing how different churches are doing it in their denominations and also what's happening on the ground locally. And honestly, I just like stealing the best ideas because because you've planted churches, like when you're trying to plant church and you're trying to reach people with the gospel, you're always trying to think about new ways that you can engage with culture. And so I just love stealing best practices, really.
And what are some of those networks you've connected with particularly?
Yeah, well, so through the Lutheran Church, like we don't have like one per se approach to church planting that we advocate for. We're very open to whatever works in your context. And I think that's really important. And so I know through the Lutheran Church, people are connected with City to City and with the Redeemer Network, and some people brush up against Acts 29 as well. But for me personally, like in the church that I lead, we're connected with what's called the Irresistible Churches Network, and so that's effectively I was going to say Australian, but it's not, because we're part of the church. Some of the churches in our network in Singapore and Hong Kong as well. So we're kind of like the Oceania wing of the North Point Partner Network. And so if people are familiar with Andy Stanley, that the network that wants to create churches that unchurched people love to engage with, that's kind of us. Yeah,
right. And some of that has been a learning piece that's filtered through into the way you've shaped your approach, would you say?
Yeah, like I think for me personally, the way that we sort of built and kind of where we felt God leading us right from the start was trying to figure out how do you reach unchurched people? Because when we originally planted Beyond, it was like third, fourth generation in our region that were unchurched. And so right from the start, we were kind of trying to figure out how we do that. And as a team, we really felt that God kind of led us to Andy's kind of seminal work on ministry, like that a lot of people know as Deep and Wide. And so a lot of our model was just trying to figure out, how do we create churches that people who don't go to church want to engage with, that they want to be around, and that we can disciple them and help them to eventually trust that Jesus is who he claimed to be.
And beyond church, tell us where it is and how long it's been going.
Yeah, so we are in the northern suburbs of Brisbane. I always say North Lakes because that's most people, if they kind of have an idea of Brisbane, know. So we're North Lakes. We're actually like 5 minutes south of North Lakes in this little suburb called Griffin. We meet in a public high school or a state high school, Griffin State School. But as in Queensland, as can only be the case, it is an independent public school. So, which means that the principal has a lot of say and can change a lot of things. And we're about to turn 7 in a couple of months, which would be the middle of 2022. We'll turn 7. And originally we met at the Lutheran Church that sent us. So that was Living Faith at Marumba Downs. And then on our 3rd birthday, we relocated to the state school, and we've been there ever since. And we just really feel it's been a great opportunity that God's opened up for us, because it's quite unique, the suburb we're a part of, in that it's over 90% residential. It's kind of one of those suburbs that people are like, let's build a lot of houses, and then they forgot that, people need food and, the amenities of life. And so there's only one place that you can have a church in that suburb, and it's in the school. So we really kind of feel real stewards of that community, along with the school, that we get the opportunity to be the body of Christ and be the people that when they think of Christians in Griffin, our name comes to mind, hopefully.
And that relationship with the school has been a good two-way exchange, hasn't it, around some things you've done in the school community for the school, as well as them blessing you with a great facility.
Oh yeah, it's been really unique in the sense that when we were looking for spaces, we couldn't get the right fit, and we kept praying. As I'm sure a lot of church planters who are listening to this know, it's always like at the last minute that God turns up. And the principal was like, "Hey, you've got 5 minutes. Share with us your mission and vision. If you don't have that, don't take the meeting." And so she really got hooked on the idea that we wanted to create a church that people who don't go to church would love to engage with. And she was like, "Oh, so hang on a minute. You're like, your goal is to make a difference in the community. Your goal is to make it better." And we're like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Well, I kind of see that as my goal. As the principal of the school, I want to make this community better. So yeah, if you want to come and see the hall that you'll be meeting in." And so the principal, the space we meet in was originally designed as a sports facility, but she knew a lot of the planning in the suburb and said, "No, that Griffin doesn't need another sports facility. What it needs is a performing arts facility." So we meet in this incredible school hall that's an incredible performing arts kind of center. And we really have tried to partner with the PNC in that community. So we've partnered with them to put on the Griffin Christmas Carnival. And the Griffin Christmas Carnival attracts between 5,000 and 7,000 people every year to the school. And we look for ways that we can really intentionally partner with them. We help them with their days at school when they have new preps and grade ones, kind of walking through the school on the early days, and just some really practical ways like that.
Wonderful. And Chris, one of the things that I remember you doing as a leader, which was interesting to me from the get-go when you planted, was you started to embed some language around your main purpose. And I kept hearing you say that Beyond Church is a church for the unchurched. And how did that get into your veins? Was it what you said about growing up and always thinking my friends wouldn't come to regular church? Was that the realization of that? Or
look, I think it was probably like a culmination of a journey when I would look around and I'd be like, man, most of my closest mates don't know Jesus, and there's no way they would ever walk into a traditional church building.
Yep.
And I was like, how do I create a space for them? And one of the challenges was when I finally had the opportunity with our team to design an environment like that. I designed an environment for church people. And I remember my wife kind of really challenged me on it one day. And Em said to me, as I was kind of talking about, here's how the service has to look, and here's what's really, really important. And she said, and she named my best mate. She said, would he feel comfortable in that space? Would he know what's going on? Would he get what you're talking about? And I said, if he kind of came enough and And pretty much the answer was no, he wouldn't. And then Emma just asked me point blank, then who needs to change, him or you?
Wow.
Because Jesus was known as a friend of sinners. So if people who don't know Jesus are not going to be comfortable hanging around with Christians in their environment, like, what are we doing? So for me, I think it was more that the language that we've probably put around it over time has just sort of helped to express what I've probably always felt, that the church should be the most welcoming place on the planet.
That's great. Yeah. Chris, one of the other things that I noticed from your church plant from the get-go, another piece of language you embedded was language of multiplication. Do you want to talk to that as something that you purposefully did from the start with your team?
Yeah. I think for me, it comes down to like, what does the local church look like? And if the local church is the body of Christ, at least to me, in the way I understand it, that means it should have the same passions and personality as Jesus. And so Jesus tells us what he's passionate about. He says his mission is to seek and save the lost. And his personality, well, you look at it when you read the Gospels, is that people who were nothing like Jesus seem to like Jesus, and he actually seemed to like them back. And so if we're doing our job of seeking and saving the lost, if people who are nothing like Jesus come to like Jesus and come to follow him because we're there, it just makes sense to me that we should be growing and that we should be multiplying, not only like churches, but we should be multiplying leadership. We should be multiplying groups. We should be multiplying responsibility, and then giving that responsibility away to others. And I think, for me, one of the most powerful examples of that comes in the New Testament, where Jesus says, like, hey, it is better for me to go, and you are going to do greater things when I'm gone. And in my mind, I couldn't even imagine what it would be like to be the disciples listening to that and be like, what do you mean? Like, you feed 5,000, like you turn like water into wine. Like, what are we going to do that's like possibly greater than this? And so, for me, I just think that's, if Jesus is happy to give responsibility away to let things grow, then we've got to, as leaders, like from the start, we wanted to be comfortable giving responsibility away and leadership away so that it could grow.
So there was that principle for you too of not only doing the work of evangelism, but developing leadership from the start of the church plant. I noticed that was another piece that seemed to be a real high value in your mind, about looking for, who are my interns going to be? Who are my apprentices going to be in leadership? And how do I get them to multiply? Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. And I don't know whether this was, I kind of maybe joke that maybe this was part of like my football back like experience, because I was a goalkeeper. Because when you say I was a footballer and I played overseas, most people think like, oh, Messi, Ronaldo, someone fancy. But I was a goalkeeper, and goalkeepers have a very specific set of skills that are not really transferable into other areas of the field. And so I think maybe one of the blessings that I got from playing that position was that I knew pretty clearly like what I was, what I think my giftings are and the gifts that God has given me, but also very clearly what they're not. And so I knew that if we're going to do this, we need to get some people with some skill sets that are not mine, and I need to get out of the road. And so I, as best as I can, I'm a bit of a control freak, but I still try as best I can. When people say, hey, what's your thoughts on this? I always say, like, are you just asking me because I'm the point guy, or you're asking me for an opinion? Because if you're asking me like for, I was having a conversation yesterday about color palettes for a rebranding little exercise we're doing. I was like, are you asking me because I'm the point guy? Because I don't have any like graphic design experience, so I can't tell you what a color palette should look like. So as much as possible, just tried to give that away and kind of embed that in who we are as a local church. Because if you get the right people with the right gifts in the right places, like, God wants to use them.
That's wonderful. One of the things you did too that became popular outside of your church plant was the podcast on leadership that you started. And Aussie Church Leaders is a great podcast. Had a lot of episodes. Now tell us about the genesis of that and the sorts of things that you include in that podcast.
Yeah, honestly, it was probably, to say it was calculated is probably being generous to us. Right. There probably wasn't a whole lot of thinking, but like, one, it was practical in that we wanted to create something for our leaders, something that was easily digestible, because as any church planter knows, like, you're thinking about this stuff all the time. It's at the forefront of your mind. But for everyone else, they got kids, they got a job, they got bosses, they got all this stuff kind of, and you're like, man, how am I going to develop these people? Because we can't keep taking nights out of their week to have a leadership nights. And so we just thought, well, you know what? We got sick of, honestly, like, sharing a lot of North American content. Not that it's not good. Like, I love all that stuff. But the problem was it wasn't really contextualized. And so we were like, well, what if we like created content that was, if you're a church planter, if you led a small church, or if you're a volunteer in a church, which over 90% of, probably bigger than that, probably closer to like 95% of all people who are engaged in the local church in Australia do it in a volunteer capacity. Why don't we create some content for them? And really, it'll just be like, let's talk about the issues that we're having in leadership at the moment and try and figure it out. And so we never run out of episodes, because we always just like, what's our biggest pain point at the moment? Okay, well, let's research that, figure out how to solve it, and then just share what we learn. So
that's great. It's a wonderful gift, and it's a fantastic resource. Aussie Church Leaders, hook into it. One of the things we love at Exponential is to hear about new resources coming out that can be shared with others, and that's another great resource for anybody listening there who's a church planter or a church leader, team leader, volunteer leader, youth leader. Great resource. Give us some idea about what you think you've been learning yourself as a leader on mission with God in the last recent days. What are some of the principles and things that you've been picking up on and learning that have meant something to you in recent days?
Yeah, I think there's I think there's some things personally as a leader, and then also organizationally I've been learning. So personally, I think the biggest thing that I've been learning is that when it comes to leadership, if you don't have a spiritual life, or if your spiritual life would go away if you weren't pastoring or leading a church, that's an issue. And so you as a leader, you really have to look after your own spiritual health. You really have to put disciplines in place. And I know there's kind of a resurgence of that, like spiritual disciplines and practices. But for me, that's been over the last maybe 2 to 3 years, something personally I've really been kind of learning and incorporating, like silence and solitude and into my own personal rhythms, but then also into taking, half-day retreats to just pray about what God wants, where God's leading us in the local church and what he's doing there. So that's kind of one thing personally. And then organizationally, as the local church, the kind of the big things that I'm thinking about at the moment are what I'm learning is I think that the churches that make the biggest difference in the future will be the churches that integrate digital well, as opposed to seeing digital as like an add-on or here's just we do this really poor replication of an in-person experience online. There'll be people who understand digital, understand the platforms, and then tailor content for those platforms that help people grow their faith. Something I learned pretty recently was that 26% of Christians in Australia said that they used a book to help them grow their faith, but also 26% of Australians said they used some sort of online resource to help them grow their faith, a podcast, a YouTube video. And I think for a lot of, maybe not church planters, but for a lot of pastors, I feel like there's legitimacy to, you read a book, that's a good thing. But, what do you mean you listen to a Christian influencer or a YouTuber or a podcast? There's almost like that legitimacy is not there, but that's what people are doing and that's where people are turning. And so I think the church should be in that space.
Yeah, that's great.
And then probably the other thing I'm learning recently is just, and it's a lesson that's just been repeated over and over and over again, is that if you focus on who you're keeping over who you're reaching, very quickly you'll stifle your mission. Whereas if you focus on who you want to reach, you'll keep the right people.
Yeah.
And I know for me, as being 7 years in, you kind of go through different changes of growth. And when you're right at the forefront and you're planting, of course we're focused on who we're reaching. Of course we're moving out. But then as time goes, then you start to go, well, what about all the Christians? What about all of us? And so your focus can begin to drift. Not that you because it's a good thing to look after and make sure that people's faith is developed. But the challenge is always are you then contributing? Are you serving? Are you living that faith out missionally? Because if you're not, then, I don't think we're discipling you well. And I think we need to rethink our discipleship strategy. So
wow, that's really helpful, Chris. There's the old saying that church planters tend to overestimate what they can achieve in the first 12 months, but underestimate what God can do in the first 7 years.
Yeah.
Has that been true of your experience?
Oh, yep, absolutely. I kind of even now I get frustrated, I think sometimes at where we're at. And I think that's natural as a leader. If you're the point person, if you're on a leadership team, you're always going to be looking into the future, seeing what's not yet, and then living in the reality of what is now. And so managing that tension, but which is why I think that discipline of silence and solitude is helpful for me, because I kind of reflect every couple of months on, wow, you know what God is doing, and God is moving, and God is preparing us. And I think for me, just recognizing ultimately that the more and more I'm in this is that we are, and I am, we're stewards of God's local church in our area. And so God's going to grow his church and we get to partner with him. And so whatever pace he wants to do it at, whatever speed he wants to do it at, whatever way he wants to do it, I just want to make sure that we make that possible. And so I think that's probably a shift for me. Whereas when I was, starting out, you're kind of like, look at what we're going to do for God. And then God's like, no.
Wonderful. Chris, it's really good to hear about Beyond and your vision for multiplying people and leadership and churches as a whole. Beyond has aspirations for the future, I know, to plant more and more churches. And I love that you have this kind of active count on your website where you're saying, who's in the game and who's yet to be in the game. I love that. It's like a little visual prompt on your website. So well done on that too. But it's a great team you have. It's a great team you're a part of nationally. And I know locally, the team that you have around you is a fantastic team and has a really big vision to go beyond yourselves and multiply. I want to thank you today for sharing with us about the Lutheran Church of Australia New and Renewing team and what it's doing, but also about Beyond. And we wish you all the best. The Exponential team and the Exponential networks will have you in our prayers. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks so much for having me, Dean.